The snow had been falling since before sunset, the heavy, silent kind that blankets a ranch until the whole world seems to hold its breath. Out past the tree line, where the fence posts disappeared under drifts and the wind carried nothing but cold, a lantern glowed against the dark like a small, stubborn promise that somebody was still awake. That lantern belonged to Frank Whitaker, and on this particular night, in the winter of a year he no longer bothered counting, it was the only light for miles. Frank was 61 years old, though the years on his ranch had carved themselves into his face in a way that made him look older to strangers and younger to the few people who still remembered him as a young man. He had a beard the color of weathered rope, gray shot through with the last threads of brown, and hands that had spent 4 decades working leather and fence wire and stubborn earth. He lived alone now, in the same house he'd built with his late wife, Carol, back when the ranch was young and their whole lives stretched out ahead of them like unbroken snow. Carol had been gone 6 years. The house had been quiet ever since, quiet in the particular way that isn't peaceful so much as it is patient, waiting for a sound that never comes. Frank had just finished checking on the horses that evening, pulling his collar up against the wind, when he heard it. A small sound, almost lost beneath the hiss of falling snow. A voice, thin and shaking with cold. "Please. Is anybody there?" He turned, lantern raised, and there she was. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, though the cold and the fear in her face made it hard to say for certain. Her hair, the color of dark copper, was matted with snow and clinging to her cheeks. Her dress, thin cotton meant for a much warmer season, was soaked through and streaked with mud, and her small hands were wrapped around themselves in the universal, aching gesture of a child trying to hold on to whatever warmth was left in her body. Frank's breath caught in his chest. "Lord Almighty," he murmured, already moving toward her, already shrugging out of his heavy coat before his mind had fully caught up with what his hands were doing. "Where did you come from, child?" She flinched at his approach, just slightly, the way an animal flinches when it has learned, somewhere along the way, that sudden movements from grown men are not always safe. Frank slowed himself immediately, dropping to one knee in the snow so he wasn't looming over her, so his face was level with hers. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, gentle as he could make his rough voice sound. "You hear me? Not going to hurt you one bit." The girl's chin trembled. Tears had frozen in thin tracks down her cheeks, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked in the middle like a branch under too much snow. "I don't need charity," she said. "I'm not asking for a handout. Just, give me a job. I can work. I can work hard. Just don't send me back." Frank felt something in his chest crack open, quiet and sudden, the way ice cracks on a pond in early spring when nobody's watching. "Back where, honey?" But she just shook her head, and her whole small body shook with it, and Frank understood, the way you understand certain things without needing all the details, that this wasn't a conversation to have out here in the snow, with the wind cutting through what was left of her thin dress. "Job talk can wait," he said, draping his heavy coat over her shoulders, swallowing her whole inside it. "Let's get you warm first. Everything else waits on that." Her name, he learned once they were inside and she was wrapped in a wool blanket by the fire, was Lucy. Lucy Bennett. She was 9 years old, and she had walked, by Frank's best guess, nearly 6 miles through the storm, following the fence line because somebody, once, a long time ago it seemed to her now, had told her that fences always lead somewhere, and somewhere was better than nowhere. She didn't want to say much else, not that first night. Frank didn't push. He had learned, over 61 years and more hardship than he cared to revisit, that some stories come out slowly, in their own time, the way frost melts off a window pane, clear patch by clear patch, and you can't hurry it along no matter how much daylight you're wasting. He heated up the stew left over from his own supper, added a bit more broth to stretch it, and set it in front of her along with a heel of bread, warmed on the stove. He watched her eat like she'd forgotten food was something you were allowed to enjoy rather than simply survive on, small careful bites at first, and then, when she realized nobody was going to take it away, faster, hungrier, until Frank had to gently remind her to slow down before her stomach protested. "There's more," he said quietly. "Plenty more. No need to rush it." She looked up at him with wide eyes, the kind of wide eyes that had clearly learned, somewhere in her short life, that plenty was not a word that got used very often. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Frank said. "Long as there's food in this house, you eat till you're full. That's not charity either, if that's what's worrying you. That's just supper." Frank had raised no children of his own. He and Carol had wanted them, had hoped for them through the early years of their marriage, but it hadn't happened, not for reasons the doctors back then could ever quite explain, and eventually the hoping had softened into a quiet kind of acceptance, the way most disappointments do if you let enough years pass over them. Still, sitting across from Lucy that first night, watching her finally start to unclench, shoulder by shoulder, breath by breath, as the warmth of the fire worked its way into her, Frank felt something stir in him that he hadn't felt in a long while. Something that had been waiting, patient as the quiet in his house, for a reason to wake back up. "You said you can work," he said finally, once her bowl was empty and her color had returned. "What kind of work you thinking a girl your age can do?" Lucy sat up a little straighter at that, like the question had given her something solid to hold onto after a long time of holding on to nothing at all. "I can gather eggs," she said. "I can feed chickens. I know how to mend a torn shirt, my mama taught me before she got sick. I can carry water. I don't eat much, and I don't complain, and I work hard, mister. I promise you that." Frank studied her for a long moment, the fire cracked and popped between them. "Where's your mama now, Lucy?" The girl's face, which had brightened talking about eggs and chickens and mended shirts, dimmed all at once, like a lantern turned down low. "She passed," Lucy said. "Last spring. Fever took her quick," the doctor said, "though it didn't feel quick to me." She paused, and Frank waited, the way he'd learned to wait. "My uncle took me in after. Said it was his Christian duty. But he had 6 of his own already, and not much to spare, and when the harvest came up short this year, he said." She stopped. Frank didn't need her to finish. He had lived long enough, seen enough hard winters and harder years, to fill in the rest of that sentence himself, and it made something old and angry stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a good while, not since the years right after Carol passed when the anger at the unfairness of it all used to keep him up at night. "He said there wasn't room," Lucy finished quietly. "So I left before he could send me somewhere worse. I heard there was a rancher out this way, an old widower, might need help around a place this size. I didn't know if it was true. I didn't have anywhere else to walk to." Frank sat with that for a long moment, the fire popping softly, the wind still pushing snow against the windows outside. He thought of Carol, of the empty chairs at his table, of the years of quiet that had settled into every corner of this house like dust nobody ever bothered clearing. He thought about all the seasons he'd spent talking to horses because there was nobody else to talk to. All the suppers eaten alone at a table built for 4. "Well," he said finally, "you heard right. I could use the help. Egg gathering, mending, all of it. I'll pay you a fair wage same as I'd pay anybody, and you'll have a room of your own, and 3 meals a day, and boots that fit, because those you're wearing look about 2 sizes too small." Lucy's eyes went wide again, but this time it wasn't fear behind them. It was something Frank hadn't seen on her face since she'd stumbled into his lantern light. Something like hope, fragile as new ice, but they're all the same. "You mean it? You'll really let me stay?" "I'll work hard, I promise, I won't be any trouble." "Lucy." Frank's voice was gentle but firm, the voice he used to settle nervous horses. "You're not trouble. You hear me? A child walking 6 miles through a snowstorm because she's got nowhere else to go, that's not trouble. That's just a hard life looking for a soft place to land. And I reckon this old ranch has got room enough for a soft place, if you're willing to make it one with me." For the first time since she'd appeared out of the storm, Lucy Bennett smiled, small and uncertain, like a smile that hadn't been used in a long while and wasn't sure it still remembered how. But it was there. And Frank, watching it, felt his own chest loosen in a way it hadn't in 6 long years. The weeks that followed unfolded the way seasons do, slow and steady, each day building on the one before. Lucy proved true to her word. She was up before dawn most mornings, gathering eggs before Frank even had the coffee going, and she took to the chickens and the barn cats with an easy affection that told Frank she'd grown up around animals, back before the fever took her mother and the world got hard. Frank, for his part, found himself talking more than he had in years. He taught her how to read the sky for weather, the old way, the way his own father had taught him, watching the clouds and the way the horses moved in the pasture before a storm rolled in. He taught her how to mend fence, how to tell good hay from bad, how to sit quiet in the evenings and just listen to the world settle around you instead of always needing noise to fill the silence. And Lucy, in her own quiet way, taught him things too. She taught him that a house could be loud with laughter again, even a small girl's laughter, even after years of thinking the house had forgotten how. She taught him that grief and joy could live in the same rooms without canceling each other out, that missing Carol didn't mean he couldn't also delight in the sound of small feet running across the porch boards. There were hard nights too, nights when Lucy woke from dreams about the fever, about her mother's hands going cold, about the uncle who couldn't spare a bowl of soup for one more mouth. On those nights, Frank would sit outside her door, not pushing his way in, just letting her know through the wood and the quiet that somebody was there, somebody wasn't going anywhere, until her breathing evened back out into sleep. "You don't have to prove you belong here," he told her once, on one of those nights, when she'd finally opened the door herself and let him sit at the edge of her bed. "Not by working harder, not by staying quiet, not by being easy. You already belong here, Lucy. Same as the barn, same as the horses. This is your home now, plain and simple, whether you're perfect at it or not." She'd cried then, real tears, not the frozen kind from that first night in the snow, but the kind that come when a person finally believes, all the way down, that they're safe. Spring came slow that year, the way it always does after a hard winter, but it came. The snow melted off the fence posts, the ground softened, and the first green shoots pushed up through soil that had seemed, for months, like it would stay frozen forever. Frank watched Lucy plant a small garden along the side of the house that spring, her hands in the dirt, her face turned up toward the sun, and he thought about how strange and quiet grace could be. How it didn't always arrive with fanfare or announcement. Sometimes it simply walked up out of a snowstorm, cold and afraid, and asked for nothing more than a chance. He thought, too, about something his own father used to say, back when Frank was young and the ranch was new and the whole world still felt uncertain and wide open. His father used to say that the Lord doesn't always send you what you're praying for. Sometimes he sends you what you didn't know to ask for, and it turns out to be exactly what your heart was missing all along. Frank hadn't been praying for a daughter. He'd stopped praying for much of anything, if he was honest, in the years after Carol passed. But watching Lucy kneel in that garden, her copper hair catching the spring sun, humming some tune under her breath that she was too young to remember was actually one of Carol's old favorites, hummed absent-mindedly around this house so many years ago, Frank thought that maybe some prayers get answered whether you remember to say them or not. There's a particular kind of loneliness that settles into a house after loss, a quiet that isn't restful so much as it is heavy, pressing down on every room until even the light seems dimmer than it used to be. Frank had lived inside that quiet for 6 long years, had nearly convinced himself it was simply what the rest of his life would sound like. And there's a particular kind of courage it takes for a child who has lost everything, a mother, a home, a sense of safety in the world, to walk 6 miles through a snowstorm on nothing but a thread of hope and the rumor of a kind old rancher who might have room for one more. What happened between them that winter wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of rescue, no grand gesture that changed everything all at once. It was smaller than that, and truer than that. It was a bowl of stew shared without judgment. A coat offered before a name was even asked. A promise, kept quietly and consistently, day after day, that this was a safe place to land. That's how most real kindness works, if you think about it. Not in the big, loud moments people write songs about, but in the small, patient choices, made again and again, to let someone in instead of turning them away, to offer warmth instead of asking what they've done to deserve it. Frank Whitaker didn't set out to save anybody that snowy evening. He just heard a voice in the dark and went to see who needed help. And in doing that simple thing, in choosing kindness when it would have been easier, quieter, safer, to stay inside by his own fire and let the wind carry that small voice past him into the night, he found the very thing his own heart had been missing without ever knowing how to ask for it. Lucy grew up on that ranch, and stayed on well into her own adulthood, and in later years, when people would ask her about the man she called her father, though he'd never adopted her on paper, only in every way that mattered, she would tell this same story. The story of the coat in the snow. The story of the man who knelt down in the cold so a frightened little girl wouldn't have to look up at him. And she would always end it the same way, with the same simple wisdom Frank had passed down to her over all those years on the ranch. You don't have to have much to give somebody everything they need. Sometimes all it takes is a warm coat, a full bowl, and the willingness to say, without hesitation, you belong here.